Good afternoon. Good afternoon and good to see you all. My name is Joseph Sikora, and I am the Dean of the School of Theology at Northeastern Seminary here at Roberts Wesleyan University. I also teach biblical interpretation, and I am glad to welcome you all today for a live webinar with Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat of the online teaching platform Bible Remixed, and also the keynote speaker of the Creation Care and Justice Conference that begins today at Roberts and Northeastern. I am deeply honored to introduce Sylvia Keesmaat to you this afternoon. She is a biblical scholar, a New Testament scholar, activist, and a farmer. She obtained her doctorate at Oxford University studying under Tom Wright, and the dissertation, if I'm not mistaken, was subsequently published as Paul and His Story, Reinterpreting the Exodus Tradition. She co-authored with Brian Walsh 2 books, Colossians Remixed and Romans Disarmed, and she is currently writing a book on ecological grief and the biblical story that should be published next year in 2025. She taught at different institutions, Oxford University, Canadian Mennonite University, Wycliffe College, and Trinity College. She authored numerous articles, book chapters, and also popular articles. She is a famous and frequent speaker at different events. She lives at Russet House Farm with her husband, Brian Walsh, and a fluctuating number of people and animals. So we're excited to have Sylvia here and listen to her presentation and also conversation with Dr. Marlena Graves. And there will be also an opportunity to ask questions at the end. A few announcements. This will be an hour-long webinar. The event is being recorded and it will be available on demand for a limited time. So check your inboxes for your access link to the recording. If you want to ask questions, and we always welcome questions, we're excited about those, you can use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen to ask your questions, and then there will be a discussion or a space to answer those questions at the end of the session. Tonight at 7:30 p.m. at the Golisano Community Engagement Center, Sylvia will speak again. Her lecture starting the Canadian American Theological Association Conference is called Torn Between Grief and Hope, Biblical Wisdom and the Climate Catastrophe. And we're looking forward to hearing Sylvia again tonight. Finally, I would like to express thankfulness and gratefulness to David and Avis Barnes and the Barnes Science and Faith Symposium, along with Roberts Wesleyan University and the Canadian American Theological Association for their generous support that makes this webinar and tonight's lecture free to attend. I now invite Dr. Marlena Graves, Assistant Professor of Spiritual Formation at Northeastern Seminary, to join us and introduce herself and pray over us before we begin our webinar.
So good to be here and with Sylvia and with you today. And this is Spiritual Formation Week. I'm the professor of spiritual formation here at the seminary, as Joseph said, and we are just delighted to be with you, delighted to have such a scholar, an activist, a person who lives what she's teaching, present to us during Spiritual Formation Week. And as I was discussing with Sylvia before we started, is that at least in my class, and I'm sure in others, we do talk about the environment and how that's part of spiritual formation, creation, caring for creation, loving all things that God has made. If you'll just take one moment with me, we're going to pray, and then we're going to get started. Let's take a moment to pray. In the beginning, Lord my God, you alone existed, eternally one, yet pregnant in the fullness of unity. Full to overflowing, you, Father of all life, exploded outward in a billion bits and pieces. Your word became flesh, whirling in shining stars, shimmering suns, and in Genesis glimmering galaxies. You, my God, spoke, and your words became flesh in sun and moon, earth and seas, mountains and gentle hills, rolling rivers and silent streams. You, my God, spoke, and your words became flesh, in winged bird, in deer and elephant, in grazing cow, racing horse, and fish of the deep. Your words, so unique and so varied, filled the earth with rabbit, squirrel, and ant. And all your words were beautiful, and all were good. From each of these holy words arose a prayer of praise and adoration to you, their creator and wondrous womb. Praise you rang out the redwood. Blessed be you chimed in the cedar. Holy are you, prayed the prairie grasses. From all four corners of this earth rose up a chorus of perpetual adoration. O sacred spirit, O divine breath of life, unseal my ears that they may ever listen to your continuous canticle of creation. Open my heart and my whole self to sing in harmony with all its many voices. Teach me to commune with your first word made flesh, your creation, that I may be able to unravel the wondrous words of your second word made flesh, Jesus, through whom, with whom, and in whom I may see myself as another word of yours made flesh, to your glory and honor. Amen. Now I'm excited to hand it over to Sylvia and learn with you all what she has for us today.
Thank you, Marlena. It's great to be here with you at Northeastern Seminary, and it's been a good week meeting students and meeting faculty, and now I'm excited to share this webinar with you. I was tempted to do the Cornell West thing and call out people I knew would be at the seminar, but I can't see anybody because it's a webinar, so which is fine. We don't have time for that anyway, because that could take a lot of time. So if Maria will start the PowerPoint, I will start us on our walk through the biblical story, which is kind of what we're gonna do this morning. We're gonna do a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump through the story. But before we do that, I'd like to begin with a number of definitions. So the first, and I'm curious to see what Marlena thinks of this, because I just thought this was a definition that worked for me in terms of what spirituality is. Spirituality is living into our calling as creatures of the earth and image bearers of the Creator. That's the definition I'm working with this morning. And so I'll come back to that as I continue the webinar. And this is also a webinar that has to do with justice. So justice is a community of shalom where all creation, all creatures, all of humanity, and the Creator can flourish together. That's kind of the biblical vision, that shalom, peace, fullness that we're looking for when justice is being done. So let's just take a hops and a skip and a jump through the story. And we'll begin with Genesis 1 and 2 to kind of ground ourselves literally in who we are, and then see how that plays out throughout the biblical story. So Genesis 1, it's not, there we are. Genesis 1 is this incredibly diverse picture of all these parts of creation coming into being, right? Animals and creeping things, domestic animals, wild animals, amphibians that live in the water, fungi, butterflies, all this. It's a picture of incredible diversity and beauty. And throughout it, you have the Creator repeatedly saying, tov, 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 right? Good, 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 or delightful, delightful, delightful. This is just wonderful. And also in the story, we have the Creator saying, let the earth bring forth. So the earth brings forth vegetation. Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. That's verse 11, the first one, verse 20. And then again, verse 24, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind. So that when God at the end of the chapter says, let us bring forth creatures, image bearers, male and female humanity, there's this sense that the very creation, the earth and the waters, are helping to bring forth human beings. So in Genesis 1, we are from the earth, and we are in the image of the Creator. And Genesis 2 reinforces that part of the story, because in Genesis 2, we are earth creature, Adam from Adamah, right? And Adamah is the earth. We are earth creature from the earth. That's the best translation I can think of. Some people say we are humans from the humus, but people tend to mix that up with hummus, and then that's a little weird. So I stick with earth creature from the earth. And it says that God caused to grow from the earth every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. So we were surrounded by a forest garden. And then we are called in chapter 2 to till and, or to serve and observe. Usually it's translated to till and keep, but to serve and observe creation. So God put the earth creature in the garden, or in the food forest, to serve and observe it. So as the story goes on, these are our roots, that we are from the earth and we are the image of the Creator. And in Genesis 2, we are from the earth and the very breath of God. God breathes into our nostrils, and we are for the earth. We are to till and to keep it. And all of this comes together. The way I like to summarize it for my students is this way, that God's original plan was to hang out by the river in a forest with a whole bunch of bugs, animals, birds, and fish, and a couple of naked vegetarians. That's the beginning of the story. And this picture actually doesn't capture it. This picture does, the incredible diversity. This is what God wanted to hang out with. This is where the Creator wanted to be at home, in the middle of this kind of a picture. So, this means that we were meant to have a lifelong engagement with a beautiful and strange otherness. I got that from Francis Weller, his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. So the ways of other creatures were integral not only to our survival, but to the shaping of our souls. We were meant to be in the middle of this wild and wonderful diversity. And if we are not part of that, then we are diminished. And I'm going to explore that in the story. So the question then becomes, actually, what happens in the biblical story when we are in that place of beautiful and strange otherness? What does it look like when we're in those places in the biblical story? And I'm going to walk us through very quickly a whole bunch of stories that where people are in the wilderness for various reasons. And we're going to just briefly outline what happens there and what this means for who we are. I am not going to focus on every single story or every single text that I can. There are plenty more, but these are the ones I just wanted to highlight. So the first is the story of Hagar. Genesis 16 and 21. Hagar, a slave woman and a victim of abuse, is cared for and sees God in the wilderness. She names God El Roi, the God who sees. And her child is named Ishmael, the God who hears. So you have somebody incredibly vulnerable. She's a foreigner, she's Egyptian, and she sees God, names God. As far as I'm aware, is the only person in the biblical story who names God, this slave woman. And God is the God who sees and the God who hears. That's how she experiences God in the wilderness. The next story, Jacob running from violence at home. Now, he brought it on himself because he's kind of a jerk. But anyway, he was still running from violence at home, and he's asleep in the wilderness, and he has a vision of angels ascending to the heavens. And he names the place where he is Bethel. God is with him. He experiences God's comfort in the wilderness. And then later, Jacob meets God in the wilderness and ends up wrestling with God in the wilderness and gets his name, Israel, one who wrestles with God, the name that is then passed on to his people. And this is just a very interesting story. He says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And so he gets the blessing in a limp out of that, which is just an interesting little little insight into to how God works, but also that God is open to being wrestled with, right? This is what the lament traditions are about in the biblical story, wrestling with God. And this is something that God expects in our interactions with God. Then Moses sees God in a burning bush in the wilderness and gets his calling. He finds out who he is called to be in the wilderness when he encounters God. And again, he pushes back. He's like, God, I can't do this. I don't speak well. I'm not surprised. I'm surprised he didn't say, and also I have a bad back. I can't do this. But, you know, but he ends up getting his calling in spite of every reason he thinks he can't do this. This is who he is called to be. So Moses finds out who he is in the wilderness, but also something about who God is. Because God, when he asks God, what name shall I say? God says, Yahweh, I am who I am, or I prefer, I will be who I will be. You will see who I am, Moses, as this journey unfolds. You will find out who I am. And we'll see that God, Moses does. And then part of who God is in that wilderness journey with the people is a God who provides in the wilderness, a God of abundance, not a God of scarcity like the Egyptian gods, but a God who provides abundance when the people do not have enough. And then as the story goes on, this is a wonderful story. If you only go off and read one thing after this webinar, go off and read Exodus 32 to 34. You know, this is when Moses is up the mountain with God. The people make this golden calf, and God says to Moses, you know, you need to go down and see what your people, who you led out of Egypt, have done. It's kind of like coming home at the end of the day. Guess what your kid did today? And Moses throws it right back at God. You know, no, these are your people who you led out. And then God says, well, that's it. I'm destroying them. And Moses says, you can't do that. What will the neighbors think? Literally, that's what it is. You can't do this. What will the Egyptians think? They'll think that you're a God who just led them out here to kill them. So God says, okay, I'm not going to kill them, but I'm not going with you, because if I get back in that car, I'm going to lose it. And Moses is like, no, you got to come with me. And as the story unfolds, Moses is pushing and pushing. Please come with us again. And near the end, in Exodus 34, when Moses asks to see God, God finally says, Yahweh, Yahweh, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and forgiving sins to the 1,000th generation. Throughout the wrestling with Moses in this story, God ends up in a place of compassion and forgiveness and says, I'm going to create new things with this people. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not only going to get in the car, but I'm going to make this work out wonderfully for you. And that becomes the most common description of God as the story, especially self-description of God as the story goes forward. So God discovers something about who God is in the wilderness. And then, of course, King David is in the wilderness and twice has a chance to kill Saul and doesn't. David discovers he's not a murderer in the wilderness. Now, later in the story, he does become a murderer. And then later again, when his son Absalom is challenging him, he goes back to that first identity. No, not a murderer. Elijah in the wilderness is in a situation of famine, is running for his life. Ravens feed him in the wilderness. And then later he finds God, discovers God in the sound of sheer silence, which I wonder actually was a silence punctuated by the sounds of birds and desert creatures and water falling and all of those things, actually. And he also discovers at that point that he's done the end of his calling as a prophet. So he discovers something about who God is and who he is. And then there are the Psalms, and I've only put 2 in here. There's like so much to say. The Psalms tell us all of creation praises God because the earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. And Psalm 98, all of creation rejoices in God's justice,
Amen.
love, and faithfulness. And that's what I loved about your prayer, Marlena, because it so beautifully captured that. That was a wonderful opening prayer. And then, of course, there's John the Baptist in the wilderness, calling the people to repentance. Jesus begins his ministry in the wilderness, where in Mark, I've put the Mark passage up here because the animals are with him. And I think actually that those days before the temptation are Jesus reconnecting with his roots. I mean, he grew up in a situation of injustice. He knew people were hungry. He knew people were ill. How do you begin a ministry except with this kind of retreat into this place where you are held, where the animals are holding you? And the temptation happens there, but temptation happens in the wilderness throughout the whole story. That doesn't make the wilderness bad. And then, of course, Jesus reenacts part of who God is in the wilderness in his ministry by feeding the 5,000, and repeatedly going and praying in the wilderness, getting that strength again and again, though they keep hauling him out of there, but he's trying. And then I'm going to jump to the end of the story. Revelation repeatedly has throughout the book, and I haven't put this all in, passages where all of creation is praising God. All of the voices of creation are praising God. In Revelation 12, the earth comes to the aid of a woman who goes to the wilderness for safety there. Even in the middle of all this environmental destruction, there is safety in the wilderness. And then the story ends with, of course, the coming in the new heaven and the new earth. And the angel shows John the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And through the middle of the street of the city, on either side of the river, is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit. So all these trees, with all this fruit, producing its fruit each month. And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. Creation will heal the nations. I also like this image because I do a lot of canning, and it's like fruit every month. No need to can any of this. There will be enough. This is the way some people have tried to kind of depict this picture. It's kind of hard to depict, you know, a river in the city with all these trees in bloom, people harvesting these trees. And remember I said that at the beginning of the story, God's original plan is to hang out by a river in a food forest with all these bugs and animals and insects and fish and a couple of naked vegetarians. It seems as though by the end of the story, when we read of all these creatures praising God, and we have this vision of the food forest, and Maria, my clicker is not working here. There we are. It seems as though God's plan is still, okay, this is actually, that's the original plan. Sorry about this, folks. Okay. I gotta go back. I was clicking it too much. Okay, I'm just gonna say it. God's plan still seems to be to hang out by the river in a forest with all parts of creation singing praise alongside people from every tribe and nation. So the picture I had there is this one. God's plan still seems to be to hang out by the river in a forest with all these people and all these parts of creation singing praise. It's still the same plan. So what happens? That's a really quick run through. What do these stories tell us about creation, God, and ourselves? What do they tell us about our calling? Well, first, we're creatures meant to be immersed in a diverse and beautiful creation. These next photos are all photos from our farm that I've taken. So that's the first thing. Secondly, God appears to meet us, and particularly those who are vulnerable, most often in the wild places. Again and again in the story, this is where people meet God. Thirdly, we discover who God is in the wilderness, right? We discover what God is like. And fourthly, God discovers who God is in the wilderness. Beginning of some of those stories, like Exodus 32, God's still trying to figure out how to relate to these people, and then discovers who God really is. And we discover, number 5, we discover who we are in the wilderness. This is also important, like David, like Elijah. And 6, God's final plan seems to be to live with us in a wilderness by the river once again. So at the end, we'll ask, what are the implications of that? Here's a slide that shows all of those things in case anybody wants to do a screenshot of that. So then the question we ask ourselves is this. Like, we live in a world that's increasingly hard to find the wild spaces, right? When I ask students about their favorite places outside, gap year students who come to our farm, increasingly they're having a hard time naming those places. One time I didn't specify outside, and so a couple people said the mall. And it's well known that more economically challenged parts of cities do not have a lot of green space, or more chillingly, or more scary, I guess, is that even in rural areas, people prefer to be inside, prefer to be on their phones. So what happens when we no longer immerse ourselves in the wild places? Or more chillingly, what happens when the wild places are gone? Well, here's what I think the implications of that are. First, we cannot fulfill our calling to serve and observe creation if we are not out in those wild spaces. Secondly, we cannot be fully human because we're not in relationship with a wild and wonderful other. Thirdly, it's impossible for us to discover who God really is, because remember, creation tells us something about God's compassion and love and faithfulness. And fourthly, it's impossible for us to discover who we are. So not only we're not fully human, but we can't even discover who we're supposed to be because we're not connected to creation. And fifth, we cannot live into the anticipation of God's hopes for us in the world. We cannot live into that vision if we don't know what that vision is. And then sixth, I had 7, which I thought was a good number, but they were repetitive. So 7, we are homeless and God is homeless, right? God's plan was to live with us and for us to live in this diverse creation. And when we're not doing that, when we're disconnected, we're untethered, we're not rooted, we are homeless. So again, there's a summary, a summary page. So what does this have to do with spirituality? With living into our calling as creatures of the earth and image bearers of the creation, image bearers of the creator and of creation, some would argue. All of these losses diminish our ability to live into our calling, both as creatures of the earth and image bearers of the creator. Because if we don't know who the creator is, we can't image God properly. And if we don't know the rest of creation, we don't know how to fully be creatures of the earth. And if we don't observe creation, we can't serve creation well, if we don't know what it is to serve creation. And so that's the first thing. That's what it has to do with spirituality. But what does it have to do with justice? If justice is a community of shalom, where all of creation, all creatures, all of humanity, and the creator can flourish together, if that's what justice is, well, then justice reframes the question so that it isn't just about us and our spirituality, but also about the spirituality of the rest of creation. So when the wild places disappear, every once in a while, there we are. When the wild places disappear, what is the effect on other creatures? That's a justice question, right? The justice for the rest, for other creatures. So, and again, I just have a number of points to go through. Other creatures can't fulfill their calling to serve the rest of creation if creation is disappearing, right? Other creatures cannot be fully themselves because they're no longer in relationship with a wild and wonderful other. This is incidentally a tent caterpillar moth. So next time you cut down those tent caterpillars and burn them, this is what you're destroying. Voices of praise to God disappear. And, oh, sorry, sorry, it's impossible for the rest of creation to discover who God really is if the wild places disappear. And other creatures are homeless and God is homeless. I put this picture up because this is a common eastern bumblebee. And in the spring, it comes at night when it's in our black locust tree. And during the day, the tree is just buzzing with all these bees. And then at night, they come down and they sleep in the cracks of the bark of the tree. It's like a bed and breakfast for the bumblebees. When we cut down, literally, when we cut down all our big trees, other creatures are homeless. So again, just a slide that summarizes all of this. So this is just kind of a hop, skip, and jump through the story and some of the implications of what happens when we are not connected to that wild and wonderful other. And this last page is just a picture I loved. It's a little bit of a sad picture because it's a goldenrod spider and it's got a bumblebee. But the colors were so amazing, and that spider's eating well tonight. And Bible Remixed is my website if you're interested in more stuff that I teach. And we are now going to move into the part of the conversation where Marlena's going to ask me some questions, and you can also post your questions based on what I said in the webinar, and we will get to those later in the hour.
Sure. Sylvia, this was amazing. Thank you for nourishing us with this wisdom. It's obvious you've spent time in the wilderness and we appreciate that. So I have two questions. I'll start with the first. Because I want to give time for students and others to ask questions, but how does the disappearance of wild things, or let me back up, let me put it this way. I once heard a Sudanese Anglican bishop say at Duke Divinity School in 2010, I remember exactly where I was, that doing theology in air-conditioned buildings, he was talking to us in the United States, has a negative effect. So my question is, how do you think not being with creation, not communing with creation for whatever reason affects our theology, we'll say here in the United States and Canada?
Right. Okay. Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, well, first of all, I think it's easier to have a theology that's disembodied, that's just in your head. If you're not doing theology in a way that's rooted and grounded in creation. And that's quite frankly is how we've ended up with the theology in the West that is so heavenly minded, it's no earthly good, to quote a number of different people. It's just, you know, a theology that has to do with a lot of disembodied concepts, that has to do with orthodoxy rather than orthopraxis, right? What you believe rather than what you're doing in the world. And we know from the history of Christianity that you can have all these orthodox beliefs,
Right.
and still do terrible things and still engage in genocide and still, you know, further the colonial project and wipe indigenous peoples out and like all of these things. Can be rooted in traditions that have orthodox beliefs. So I think that's one thing. But I think the other thing is our theology should be rooted in a story that takes place on the land in creation. If we're not reading the biblical texts outside, we're missing half of the story. If we're reading the story of Hagar and we've never been outside in the heat thirsty, we can't possibly know what Hagar was experiencing and the overwhelming relief of knowing that God is the God who sees us when we've been driven out by violence and are hungry and thirsty. Like, our theology isn't going to help us understand what's happening in Gaza if we haven't read those stories in contexts where we see the way that God comes to people in that kind of a situation. So those are just two ways I think that, yeah, just reading disconnected affects negatively our theology.
Wonderful. Something for us to think about, and I hope to keep contemplating it in my classes. The other question I have is, not everyone has I don't want to say privilege, because in some areas of the world, people do live outside
Mhm.
and everyone's in a different circumstances, but I'm thinking about, and you mentioned this, I'm thinking about people in urban areas that don't have a lot of access, as you said earlier,
Mhm.
to green space. Could you talk a little bit about how you think about that, and maybe how we as the church um, should address that? Because it seems to me that that's another injustice done to people that don't have access to the wild things, except for maybe, I'm thinking maybe some flowers, you know, that come through the cracks, or whatever it is. They're just in a very polluted area.
Yeah.
There's so many reasons why, discrimination, poverty. How should we think about that? And maybe what's a good orthopraxis way to address it?
Well, this is a really good and important question. I mean, this is a question of justice,
Right.
right? And spirituality. And, you know, I know a Mennonite congregation in, Indiana that decided, they wanted to do baptisms in the river nearby. But when they got there, they discovered the river was so polluted. Nobody could put their head under that water. And so the river became part of their congregation.
Wow.
And they started ministering to that river and cleaning the river up and going and checking the health of the river. And eventually they commissioned a pastor, a chaplain for the river.
Wow.
And they prayed for the river. So one thing in the city, I mean, our cities often have buried them, but our cities are part of watersheds, right? So church communities, I think, need to be becoming more deeply embedded in the watersheds in their cities, and learning how to serve and observe that watershed. If this is an area that is no longer a green area, and a lot of you know, poorer neighborhoods and cities, they've done studies, they have fewer trees, they have fewer parks, there's not as much access. Church communities should be saying what used to be here, and what can we bring back? What are the creatures who should be living here? How can we serve those creatures? So, you know, starting pollinator gardens and community gardens and planting trees, those are all part of ministering to your community, non-human community, and human beings in that area, who need to be reconnected and need to find places to connect with creation. You know, on another level, there's, you know, the whole planting where you can, but that's, you know, that's a whole other thing that's could be more deeply personal, but also could be part of church congregations. So I don't want to go on too long.
No, that's amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of food for us to eat now and from after you leave. I'm gonna ask one more question, and before I turn it over to the students. And I'm very fascinated by your thoughts on God being homeless. I know one I don't wanna say definition, but one way to think of salvation is being home, being in a home. And grounded and rooted in location. And so could you talk a little bit more about God being homeless? Because I've never reversed it and thought it that way. I've thought about what happens to us metaphorically and physically if we are without a home.
Right. Well, I must say that all of my reflection on home, I'm indebted to my husband, Brian Walsh, who's written a book called Beyond Homelessness. And so I've been taking his thoughts and running with them myself. I mean, I just think it seems so clear from the beginning of the story that God had hoped to be at home in this creation and to be at home with us. And the whole of the biblical story, like the whole trajectory of the story after the fall, is God working to bring healing and wholeness so that God can once again live with us, be at home with us. You know, God called Abraham to form a people where God could be at home once again. I mean, it's interesting. God didn't say to Abraham, Abraham, I'm calling you so that we can have a close and personal relationship with each other. God's like, this is about a community. Torah, the law, was about shaping a community where God could once again be at home. When Jesus comes, it's to show everybody what it looks like when God is at home in their midst.
Amen.
Right? This is all that's going to happen. Healing and enough food and parties, all of that's going to be part of God being at home in our midst again. So, and that, of course, as I said, that's the end of the story. God just wants to come and live with us again. And in John 1, it says Jesus came and tabernacled amongst us, tented amongst us. In Revelation 21, it's the same word. God will come and tabernacle, tent amongst us again. And I know that in the US as well as in Canada, the people in tents right now are homeless people, and the people in the Sudan and Gaza and the Ukraine, right? So it's a powerful image, I think, on a number of different levels. But it seems clear that that's all God wants, is to be at home in our communities and in this world. So how can our calling is to live into shaping that kind of community, I think, where God can be at home.
Yeah, home where God is comfortable, can move around, is refreshed. I've thought about that, God being refreshed in our life.
Yes,
But not just in our lives, in our physical spaces.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to put it. I like that.
Oh, no,
yeah.
It's, or is it polluted? Where God, it was God's home polluted.
Yeah.
And so, this is beautiful. I think I might get it wrong. Is it John 12 or 14 where Jesus says, we will go and make a home. That home is very important. God, that thought of home.
Yeah.
Well, we want to give a chance for those on the webinar or watching this now and later, but now to offer up some questions, and we're for Sylvia, and we're happy to answer those if you have some questions. So everyone's greeting you, and it says, Deborah asked, could you say something about the place of the city in God's good vision for the future? How does the holy city in Revelation 21 and 22 fit with the picture of a restored wilderness?
Okay, that's a good question. And actually there's another question as well from Cord Sullivan, Chris. I wonder about the trajectory of the biblical story as moving from a garden to a city, and how the development of culture, urban or otherwise, is important to the flourishing of creation. Could you talk about how you think about this movement from a garden to a city as it connects to your talk here? So that fits in with Deborah's question too. I guess the way the city kind of unfolds in the biblical story is there's the city is often not a place of faithfulness. It's a place where there is poverty. There's you have Babylon and the big cities of Babylon, Rome. By the time you get to the book of Revelation, the words that are used, the symbols that are used for how things have gone awry in creation is the city, Babylon, standing in for Rome, and the kind of inequalities and abuse of creation that happen in those urban contexts, and how that filters out to the wilderness. So particularly when, say, the book of Revelation was written, the impact that cities had on the countryside around, there was a dead zone around most cities because of what happened in the urban centers. Which is why I think it is all the more beautiful that the story ends with this Jerusalem, the holy city, coming down. This is a renewed city where there is no more mourning or crying or tears or tears. I think because all of the injustices that have been described, earlier in the book of Revelation, those have now been wiped away. But also, the city becomes a place where the wilderness is present as well. And this is not something you saw in the ancient world. I mean, cities really, except for maybe the hanging gardens of Babylon, and those who were wealthy could have green areas or gardens in the ancient world, but for the vast majority of the people, cities were not green spaces. And so to have a renewed city where all the culture and learning and the music and the art that happens when you have that happens in those denser urban places. Though I don't want to romanticize that either. I mean, you know, indigenous peoples not living in urban contexts had very vibrant artistic cultures as well. But that river and those trees, this is really a city that has also become a food forest.
Mhm.
So the question for us becomes then, how can we renew our cities?
Mhm.
How can we bring that vision of wilderness into our cities? And there's cities doing this around the world. Medellin, Colombia is doing it. Singapore, it's happening. You know, various cities are largely because they know that this is something they need to do to mitigate climate catastrophe. This is happening. And so we don't have to go far to see what that can look like and how that wilderness and city can coexist in harmony. So I hope that gets at your question. There's a lot more to say about that city thing.
Oh, yeah, no, I appreciate
Yeah.
you bringing that in, because some people are like, oh, I don't live in the country, I live in a city or an urban area. And Lynn, you mentioned romanticize, and Lynn asks, can we over romanticize our relationship with nature? I'm thinking of a line paraphrase from an essay. Falling into a hole in a partially frozen slough in the middle of North Dakota winter is as close to nature as humanity can survive. So, and maybe, Lynn didn't say that, but I know I'm gonna butcher this, but the nature tooth and claw, right? Nature is also violent. Animals, predatory animals can kill, and, so it's not, there is beauty, but there's also something kind of fearful about nature. So I guess, can you talk about over romanticizing, as Lynn asked, the relationship with nature?
Well, I mean, it's kind of ironic that the place where nature gets over romanticized in our culture is actually like Disney contexts, right? Or the way we do conservation, the way we set up our national parks and do conservation. There are two mythic trajectories here. You know, the biblical story talks about creation praising God, about the need to observe and serve creation. And part of observing is respecting how creation works, right? Nobody wants to fall into a bog or the slough in the middle of winter. But, you know, maybe if you knew your land a bit better, that wouldn't happen in the middle of winter, right?
Say that.
So, you know, there's parts of our property, we live on a 50-acre farm, and when we go down to the woods, you know, in early winter or in late winter, there are areas where I don't go unless I'm prepared to get very wet. Because I know where the swamp starts, or the marsh. I know where it starts. So, you know, that nature read in tooth and claw, that comes out of a mythological world, that comes out of Greek and Roman mythology, where Gaia, the earth, was actually a malevolent force. That's why in Revelation 12, it's so astounding that the earth, Gaia in Greek, comes to the rescue of the woman. Because if you look at all the, you know, if you look at various, you know, the Parthenon friezes, for instance, if you look at sculpture in the ancient world, Gaia was part of a mythology that was malevolent against humanity, and Gaia was the mother of the giants that were out to destroy people. If you grew up reading, or your children read, the Percy Jackson series, you know, Rick Riordan captures this very well, this mythology. So I think that's where and the Roman world, let me just say this too, was a world increasingly moving away from being embedded in the natural world, right? Extinctions happened in ancient Rome. That's when the forests all got cut down. That's when Africa started to be a desert. So
Wow.
you've got a population becoming increasingly urban in that context, and people being pushed off the land. That's where I think that inimical, that adversarial relationship to nature started to capture the Western imagination. It's not an indigenous worldview. And I wouldn't say that indigenous peoples romanticize nature either. But it's not that adversarial relationship. The biblical story is about being in relationship with creation, us, God, and creation. And that's important to remember. And relationship means, just like a relationship you have with your spouse or with your kids or with anybody else, being in a relationship doesn't necessarily mean it's romantic, right? Sometimes it can start that way and then, okay, not so much anymore, and then back. But I think the language of relationship is key.
Okay, that's fantastic. I have one more question, or there's one more question for you. So the way you speak about creation, you even talk about it, and I think this maybe comes from what you said, relationship. It's more alive than, maybe in the West, not everyone in the West, right? Not indigenous people, but it's more alive. Do you think there's something to it? I know Eastern Orthodoxy and some other, branches of Christianity pay more heed to the aliveness of creation, but then there's others, like some Protestants, or even, Saint Francis said, Brother Moon, and some people are like, no, that's, you're putting God into all these things. That's not God. You're anthropomorphizing creation. Could you talk to us a little bit about that as we wrap up?
Okay, that's a really good question. I mean, science is increasingly showing this. The world of biology, the way that trees are alive and relate to one another and relate to the mycelium in the ground that feeds the trees and communicate with one another. I mean, if communication is sound waves, trees do that too. So even things that we think of as less animate, there's even studies showing that plants feel pain, trees feel pain. Which was the stuff of science fiction when I was a kid. I remember reading Alfred Hitchcock stories about that, but now scientists are talking about that. The scripture certainly has this sense of rocks and rivers and streams praising God.
Yes.
That praise might not sound like anything like human praise sounds, but scriptures certainly have that worldview. But my experience is, when I'm out in the woods or in our fields, when I'm looking at insects or other animals, that there really is not just that they're alive and going about their business, but that they have subjectivity, that there are choices that they make, that the rest of creation praises God as well, in ways I don't even understand sometimes, and that the call to serve and observe creation is something we do, the other creatures do as well. So there are ways our cows serve creation, feed creation. There are ways that the insects serve creation, and some insects get around that by, not going into where the pollen is to get the nectar, but boring in the side, like mining bees. So it just seems to me that there are just a myriad of ways that all parts of creation are subjects, and give thanks and give praise and grieve when habitat is lost, when their offspring die. That's part of what's happening in creation too, and the biblical text talks about that as well. So I must say that this way of thinking about creation started with the Bible for me.
Right, of course.
And then I went out and was like, yes, I'm seeing this.
And I think we would think twice about destroying things if we're not, if we're out in creation, we mourn and grieve with it. Like there is, I think, I want to be in solidarity with you in that. I think there's a grief to creation. I do not think we have enough time to answer the next question, Ian, but
I can say one thing really quickly to
Okay.
Ian's question.
Do you
His
wanna say
question
what it
was
is?
about the translation of Genesis 2:15.
Mhm.
And I got the translation I have from Ellen Davis's book,
Oh, yeah.
Scripture, Culture, Agriculture.
Yeah,
So, if you want to see the argument for that serve and observe translation, Ian, Ellen Davis, Scripture, Culture, Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible. And she is brilliant. It's a brilliant book all around. Everybody should read it.
well, we have had quite the education here today. I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for your convictions and wisdom and for sharing it with us. I'm gonna talk to you more about that later to see if we can get you here some more. But we have been nourished and blessed by your presence. And so I'm gonna close and just wanted to say to those of you watching, listening, check your inbox for an email from the seminary with special access to this on-demand recording. There's gonna be a recording of this webinar, and you can learn more about Northeastern Seminary and invite other people to come at our website. We have lots of certificates, and thank you to those that sponsored this webinar. Thank you to Richard Milton and Chris Lacali and Dr. Sikora, everyone that made this possible for you to be here. And just to remind you, tonight, Sylvia will be speaking at 7:30, I believe, in the Golisano Center here on campus. So you can come and listen to her for free because of the generous sponsors. Have a wonderful day. The Lord be with you, and we pray that creation will flourish. Amen.